I had the chance to interview novelist and filmmaker Nicholas Meyer. Nick is most known for being the uncredited writer and the director of Star Trek II: Wrath of Khan, but the second thing he's most known for is his Sherlock Holmes novels. I have loved Sherlock Holmes novels ever since I was in college and started reading Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's books, but I did find this one book called The 7% Solution that was not written by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, but had so much of his flair, but still had kind of an original take on it. When I found out that the author was Nicholas Meyer, I was just blown away. Nicholas Meyer has at this point written 5 Sherlock Holmes novels, his latest being The Return of the PHAROAH. How's your morning going so far?
Well, it's fine. I wrote a page.
That's something. That's the thing about writers, is the discipline of getting it written, whether you rewrite it or not. It's just writing, correct?
You right?
So you've been a novelist, a screenwriter, and a director, but what is it your preferred kind of job description?
On my website, it says storyteller.
And why do you choose that over all the other individualized one? Do you think it's all encompassing?
Yes, I think that I am fond of many media. I am fond of movies, books, plays, opera, ballet. I'm fond of all those things, but the thing that unifies them is that I'm fond of stories. And I think to some extent, the contents of the story usually suggests, if not dictates, the best format for it. Some stories are so visual that you think in cinematic terms, and others may lend themselves more to a book or a play. So I'm like Polonius. I didn't care whether it was comical, tragical, pastoral, science fictional, historical, biographical. It didn't matter, as long as it was a good story. And somebody said to me, "What's your definition of a good story?" And I thought about this and said, I think that a good story is one that after you hear it, you understand why I wanted to tell it.
You've also written about 5 novels about a certain detective in London. Where did your interest in Sherlock Holmes kind of originate from?
The short answer to that is my father, who was a very cultivated man, very literate, very well read. He was also a first-rate pianist. He was a shrink. And when I was about 11, he gave me the complete Sherlock Holmes stories in the one volume with Christopher Morley as the editor. And I gobbled those up. And in a sense, this is again the short version, never let go.
So your first novel, The 7% Solution, was pretty revered, and you wrote that at a pretty young age. How old were you when you wrote that?
I think I was about 27. I think it was published when I was 28, I think. Something like that.
So how did you manage to get to be the screenwriter? Like, did you negotiate that? Was that a kind of a requirement for you? How did you get to do the screenplay of the movie adaptation of it?
I said I wouldn't sell the book unless I got to write the script. And since I had been writing screenplays with some success before that, they were comfortable with that idea.
And what was that experience like as the adaptation and working with a director on your novel, where obviously in a novel you're basically godlike, you have total control over it, but when it's a screenwriter, that's generally not the most revered position on a film set. So
Yes, it's like being co-pilot.
yeah, all the blame and none of the responsibilities, I guess.
I was enormously fortunate in many ways that Herb Ross was the director of the movie. Herb loved the book. He was very respectful of writers, and he did something that was, I think, virtually unheard of. I said, I am planning to become a film director. That was my goal at the time. And I said, I want to be on the set. I want to be part of this. I want to watch what happens. I want to learn, because I had never really done anything like that. And he said, absolutely, you're going to be in Europe, you're going to come, you're going to be there. And interestingly enough, the process of adapting the novel to the screen, I learned a great deal by doing it. And the most important thing I learned, I suppose, was to be ruthless with your own material. And if things didn't work or you thought they weren't going to work, they had to be sliced out. I think the movie is a very good movie. It's very wordy, because I still hadn't learned until I started to direct that a lot of words are superfluous, and you can do things with pictures. But nevertheless, the words that are in the movie are smart, they're funny, they're good, and one of the things that I thought, and I preface this by saying that artists are not the best judges of their own stuff. They lose all proprietary authority over these things when they're finished, and they're out in the wide world, and good luck to you. People will make of them what they will. But it was my opinion that Sherlock Holmes meeting Sigmund Freud, which is what the book is about, was a really cool idea. That the idea that he was going for a cocaine withdrawal cure, thanks to Watson, that was all really great. The meeting was great. The problem was great. The addiction was great. All that stuff. And then the idea of the book, for those who haven't read it, is that Freud and Holmes wind up collaborating on a mystery. And in that mystery, an exchange of values takes place. Freud gets Holmes off cocaine, and Holmes shows Freud the whole idea of deductive reasoning that puts Freud on the path to psychoanalysis. All of that was great, except I didn't think that the mystery that they solved, that they were given to solve, was the best mystery it could have been. So I decided to change it. And I viewed writing the screenplay as a chance to take a second whack at this material, and maybe to make it better as opposed to merely preserving it. And one of the things that I also thought, which was an impetus for that to change, was that if you read a book with a mystery in it, and The 7% Solution was the #1 best-selling novel in the United States, so a lot of people had read it, and they knew the mystery already. I remember noticing this when I went to see the movie of Presumed Innocent, which was a Scott Turow novel, and I'd read the novel.
And the Alan J. Pakula film.
Pakula, yeah. And I knew who had written, I knew who had done the murder, because I read the book. So we're all going to find out, who, but we all knew it wasn't going to be a surprise. So I thought, let's make it a surprise what happens in the second half of this story so that people can't just sit back and say, oh yes, I know where this is going, blah blah. So I took those opportunities to change the movie while preserving the essential story and characteristics of the story. Holmes meets Freud, etc., through the linkage of cocaine. And the only arguments I ever had with Herb Ross, who I thought was a really lovely guy, and I was extremely fond of him, and I owe him much, is that I was more ruthless than him. And sometimes, and I was always saying, you have to cut this, you have to cut this. And he was saying, no, you're crazy, you're whatever. And I remember specifically, there's a tennis match in the book. Sigmund Freud plays tennis. And I said, we have to cut the tennis match. And Herb said, what? I said, the whole movie's going to stop while two guys play tennis? This isn't Strangers on a Train, where Robert Walker is going to go to the amusement park and bury the cigarette lighter to pin the murder on Farley Granger. This is just like a tennis match in the middle of the... And Herb's answer was, no. Everybody loves the tennis match from the book. That was his rationale for keeping it, because everybody loves it. And I thought, oh, this is wrong, you know. But then it turned out he was right, because not only did he make it work, but I took the secret of how Freud winds up winning the tennis match against this much better player, presumably. And I made it pay off at the end of the movie when it turned out that, the Baron has no backhand. And so I made it pay off where I don't think it had paid off before. Anyway, he was right about that.
Interesting. I love the fact that you're talking about being brutal with your own material. That's why I think a lot of, on the level of kind of independent filmmakers, they fall too in love with their work, and in the edit, they don't understand that it just sometimes doesn't work, and you need to cut it. I think that's fantastic advice. But the last 3 of your Sherlock Holmes novels I just read in the last 2 to 3 months, Peculiar Protocols, that one stood out because it seemed to be weirdly the most personal to you, at least to me as a reader. It felt the most personal to you, or how much of that was historical based, like about the actual protocols? At what point was the fact and fiction derivating from each other?
Did you ever Google the protocols?
I did, and saw some of it, but again, I don't want to make everybody else have to Google it too.
The novel is personal, maybe not in ways that you might assume. For those who are unfamiliar with the protocols of the learned elders of Zion, let me explain, number one, that this is the most famous and celebrated and vicious and destructive forgery of all time. It was put out by the Okhrana in 1904, the Tsar's secret police, and it purports to be the minutes of a secret meeting of Jews plotting to take over the world. And it was used as an excuse, and it's still used as an excuse to go after Jews. It's Vladimir Putin quotes them. And they were exposed as fakes. By 1920, they were exposed as fakes. But that didn't stop Henry Ford from publishing them in their entirety in his newspaper, the Dearborn Independent. He wound up being sued for libel, and he lost his paper over it. But they're still used as textbooks in the Middle East, in Muslim schools, and so it's a hoax and a forgery that won't die, because it's a convenient forgery for anti-Semites. But
Talk about relevant for today, too.
yeah, unfortunately, scary shit. There's no question. But what I was getting at when you said it was a personal book, and I said, yes, it is, but not maybe for the reason that you might think, which is that I happen to be a Jew. In fact, the reason that the book became personal to me dates back to when I wrote the 7% Solution, and I went to I was on a book tour with the book. I think I landed in Pittsburgh in a thunderstorm, and this newspaper man was assigned to come out and talk to me. And he said, "How does it feel to be a successful forger?" And I kind of swallowed and I thought, well, yes, the 7% Solution, it doesn't say it's by Nicholas Meyer. It says it is a reprint from the reminiscences of John H. Watson as edited by Nicholas Meyer. Yes, it is a kind of a forgery, isn't it? And I am a kind of a forger. And that conversation got me very interested in the subject of forgery. And I started amassing a huge library about forgery, just on that subject, and very famous forgers, Han van Meegeren, Elmire de Hory. There's a lot of them. Chatterton and Ossian, and there's a lot of books about it. And forgery prompts a whole series of ethical, legal, moral, aesthetic, financial questions. What is the difference between a forgery and a copy? Something you cannot see. The intention. If you have two paintings, and this is a hypothetical, if you have two paintings that are completely identical in every respect, and you cannot tell the difference by any technical or technological means, you cannot tell which is better. And one was painted by me and the other by Leonardo da Vinci, but you cannot tell the difference. Why is one better than the other? And it's a tough question. And the best answer I heard in all of my reading and research, someone said, well, one could not exist without the other. And I thought, oh, this is really fascinating stuff. And so when I found myself learning about the protocols of the learned elders of Zion, I thought, yes, Sherlock was alive and well when these protocols were first, revealed, forged, whatever, disseminated. It would be interesting to see him go up against this terrible thing. It also was a foregone conclusion that he would lose. He would fail. The protocols are still around. People are still falling for them or being asked to fall for them. And I thought, yes, if you read the original Conan Doyle stories, there are other cases in which Sherlock Holmes fails. And so I thought, okay, and that makes him human. That makes him real. And so I thought, okay, let's try pitting Holmes up against the protocols. And I mulled that idea for a good 10 years until my agent, Charlotte Sheedy, handed me a nonfiction book by a professor, Steven Zipperstein. It's called Pogrom, and it's about pogroms in Russia, and it's about the protocols. And I learned a great deal, and suddenly this all sort of fell into place.
Did you feel that any part of it was kind of a commentary on kind of modern times? Because to me, what I found most relatable about it, especially nowadays, was just with the internet, the level of disinformation, which is kind of my milieu at the moment. Is I'm working on a documentary about cyber crimes and cyber stalkers, and just the ability to disseminate misinformation is so extreme today that I found that was a weird parallel to this novel that's taking place decades ago.
It has the potential, the internet and its misinformation, of being our downfall. We'll tear ourselves to pieces over bullshit.
That's a part of human history, I think, is dictators have used that as a tool forever.
The big lie.
I think that just again, not to make it too political, but it's seeing that it's even without politics, thanks to social media, we're seeing a higher level of sociopaths utilizing misinformation for advantageous reasons.
There's no question. It's a terrifying situation, and it's a terrifying prospect.
I just finished about 2 weeks ago Return of the Pharaoh, and I loved it. I went to Egypt 20-something years ago, and I found that so much has not changed in Egypt. When I read the word bakshish, it just flooded me with memories of this word, and I think you even have it in the book, that it's a unique Egyptian word that combines gratuity and bribe into one magical word. Because for myself, when I went to Egypt, they'd be like, no flash photos, bakshish. Okay, flash photo. It's like, it's kind of a gratuity bribe all in one. And
You say you were there 20 years ago. I was there in 1979.
Is that the last time you were there?
In 79, I found myself in Alexandria and Cairo. And that very memorable experience, including climbing in through the robber's entrance. It's very narrow.
I did that too.
Very scary to do because you can't turn around.
Yep.
And so all of that stuff went into the book because I love all that. I grew up watching, Land of the Pharaohs and Valley of the Kings and the Egyptian. I loved all those spear and sandal movies, and they excited my imagination. And movies can bring to life in some way. They can visualize for you other lands, other places, other civilizations. Suddenly you can see them building the Great Pyramid, Land of the Pharaohs. Even Martin Scorsese says, this is what you call a guilty pleasure. Howard Hawks went to Egypt, and they hired 20 gazillion people, and they said, let's tell the story of how they built the Great Pyramid. And yes, Joan Collins is in it. And yes, she has a jewel in her navel, which apparently kept falling out during scenes. But it's a lot of fun, that movie. It's a lot of fun. And I have this theory, and I'm sure I'm not the only one who has it, that childhood experiences are the most lasting, the most potent. You see a movie when you're 10 years old, you read a book when you're 10 years old, you're going to glom onto that. I read Sherlock Holmes when I was 11, and wow, talk about, being branded with a hot iron. That was it. And so sure, the idea when it was my agent who said, what about Holmes in Egypt? And I thought, oh yes, here's two of my favorite things. Put them together.
See, exactly what you just said is, for me, Raiders of the Lost Ark, when I was 9 years old, a lifelong fascination with Egyptology followed. And I mean, when I went, it was because of Harrison Ford and that bullwhip.
Yeah, I'm sure that makes perfect sense.
So the other thing is, I noticed you had a historical character, Howard Carter, who's famous for finding the tomb of Tutankhamun. Nothing irritates me more than hearing Tutankhamun. Knowing the proper pronunciation, Tutankhamun. So that was interesting. Is like, how, I mean, did you do research on what his personality was, or did you just take free reign as a writer to invent
Both,
personality?
both. I did a lot of research about Howard Carter and the Tomb and King Tut. Let's compromise. And I have a whole bunch of books about this, and I read about them. And then I, made up what I wanted. For example, in the 7% Solution, I don't think Sigmund Freud was a tennis player, but he plays tennis in my novel. I don't think he was shoveling coal into a locomotive while they were doing a high-speed chase across Europe, but he does it in the novel. So Howard Carter, you start with the real person, and then you stick them in the story, at which point you have to make plausible what they do in the story. That's why it's called a historical novel and not a history or not a biography. I sometimes think that people, particularly in our post-literate world, don't quite understand that movies may look like history, but they're not history. They're dramas, they're stories, they're fiction. If you read a novel, by definition, you're reading fiction. Novel equals fiction. If you read a historical novel, you are reading historical fiction. But if you are reading a biography or a history, you are entitled to believe that the author is giving you the most accurate version that they can find or dig up or research of certain events. But those distinctions disappear when you go to the movies. When you go to see The Deer Hunter, which is a very compelling movie, very well executed, about Americans in Vietnam, you might be led to believe, watching that movie, that the North Vietnamese forced American POWs to play Russian roulette. That's pretty bad. It just so happens that there's no piece of evidence whatsoever that Americans were ever forced by their North Vietnamese captors to play Russian roulette. The movie's very convincing. Pictures are convincing. Pictures are worth 1,000 words. But that doesn't necessarily make them true. And when we get our history from the movies, and some, are pretty good. When you look at that television series about Chernobyl, or when you watch The Crown, these things are very convincing, and they're very well done in both instances, but they're not necessarily legally, morally, ethically, anyway, they're not the historical record. They are dramatizations in which what we call poetic license, dramatic license, has been used. So it's a little bit dicey for people to believe that movies are the same as histories. Documentaries is different. Documentaries, you're assuming that this is nonfiction.
Oh, I agree with that completely. So I did notice one thing that I wanted to ask purely for myself, which is in that novel, On the Train, they make reference to an alienist from New York. Now, was that an homage to little Caleb Carr and his book, his novels, The Alienist and Angel of Darkness, or was that just a random happenstance?
It was happenstance. I don't think I was thinking about it.
Really? Are you familiar with Caleb Carr? Because he eventually did his own Holmes novel, The Italian Secretary, which was very good. But
I haven't. I didn't read it, The Italian Secretary. I read The Alienist when it came out, but I think The Alienist from New York was really my dad.
Really? Interesting. Oh, that's fantastic. So you kind of like bring it all back together.